As reported in my memo to you of January 15th, we've received rebuttable presumption forms from approximately 700 manufacturers and importers for approximately 5,600 products. And as a result of these products on our website list of alcoholic beverages that have rebutted the presumption of the regulation, they therefore are not being taxed as distilled spirits. Also, since the date of my memo, we received a request from the Department of Finance to submit a negative spring finance letter based on the limited revenue that we have received. And on this matter, I will need board direction to.
Well, I find the situation disturbing. This FMB regulation was supposed to generate $38 million in tax, but from what I understand, it's only generated $6,000 to date. We have an abundance of manufacturers who are rebutting the presumption. We have no way of knowing whether the manufacturers which have rebutted the FMB presumption did actually reformulate their products. Clearly, to fully implement the regulation, we need to have some way to verify the contents of flavored malt beverage products to ensure that there actually is compliance. I think this is a really serious problem, and I would like to have staff identify resources that could be redirected in the current fiscal year to establish a rudimentary testing program for the FMBs. I would like to have at least a sample of the FMBs analyzed to see if these products have actually successfully rebutted the presumption. And if this preliminary testing program identifies compliance problems in the industry, then it would justify moving forward with a more comprehensive testing program next year. But if we have no way of checking whether the claims are really true by these manufacturers, then basically chaos reigns. So I'd like the staff proposal to be submitted for the board action at the meeting scheduled for March 16th and 17th in Sacramento.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. Mr. Leonard?
I'm sorry, what do you want on the March agenda?
I want a proposal for a sampling testing program.
Okay. Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The manufacturers lost in the courtroom, but they won in the chemical lab. They have succeeded in reformulating their products, and while I admit, Dr. Chu, I'm curious kind of how they did it. I'm also cognizant that it is probably impossible for us to ever figure out whether the formula is exactly as they say or not. Alcohol is alcohol, and we're trying to distinguish whether it comes from beer or whether it comes from distilled spirits. It's still an alcohol molecule, and all the research I've done, it's indistinguishable. That all we have to go on is their report. I suppose we could go walk through their plant, but my level of trust is not super high either. But I just don't like throwing good money after bad. We're not collecting the revenue. It was probably never there in the first place. It was a number made up statically on the products that existed prior to the adoption of our regulations. It's a general fund item. Our general fund is in dire situation. I'd like to hear. I obviously don't object to discussing it again in March, but I'm very skeptical that it would be money well invested to continue to have our staff go after this source of revenue that is just not there and would be very difficult to track down. So I think we should withdraw our finance letter, and that we should redirect our staff to other more productive revenue-generating activities.
Ms. Leonard, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, we still have an obligation to implement the regulation, which is valid. I would be interested in seeing a proposal from staff pursuant to Dr. Chu's request. And we're talking about a sampling here, so it's not, we're not talking about looking at every single product in terms of testing. Secondly, I do think, I mean, from my purpose, certainly my support of the regulation was not necessarily revenue-driven, although that certainly would have helped the state's situation. But to the extent that the revenue is not forthcoming at this point in time, I do think we need to come true about that with respect to submitting the letter to finance. So I'm actually trying to make the two issues distinct here, and would propose that we submit the negative finance letter to reflect the revenue situation as we currently recognize it, but would like to continue our responsibility with respect to implementing the regulation pursuant to Dr. Chu's suggestion.
Could we possibly wait on the negative finance letter, though, until we have some proposal on the sampling?
What is there a deadline?
The finances, I understand, requested it by February 13th.
For the May revised.
They do have to.
Could request an extension.
I mean, it's just to reflect the decrease in the revenue, not with respect to the resources for the workload that still exists.
My understanding was that they were looking for a complete withdrawal of it.
Okay, I'm not supportive of that. I mean, we still have a valid regulation in place. We have a responsibility to implement it, and I think I just from doing and knowing how precarious the budget is these days, I would like to, really kind of reflect truth in budgeting with respect to what we are recognizing as revenue coming in. Understanding there's a deadline, but I am not. We have an obligation here.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Leonard.
I agree with your premise. We have valid regulation. We have a duty to enforce it. We've enforced it with an extensive database. We've double-checked that they've completed filings at other agencies as required. There's not the money there. We're a revenue agency, and we do need to tell finance that, and we can't just say it's somewhere between $5,000 and $34 million. We've got to tell them. It strikes me as we have a valid regulation that says there's sales tax on buggy whips, but they're just not making buggy whips anymore. And for us to hire auditors and investigators to go see if there's any buggy whips out there is a waste of resources. An effort was made. It's legally valid. The staff has done an extremely diligent effort to collect the data and to analyze it and to verify it, and there's not revenue there. We're not pursuing an action against one manufacturer.
We are not going to be generating $38 million in tax revenues, so there has to be a change, in what we are estimating this will cost. So, but on the other hand, I'm not willing to pull the plug on this whole thing. I'm clearly not willing to, because we have an obligation to those petitioners who submitted this, and we've gone through this entire process, and I think we have an obligation to find out what the truth is behind these applications. So I'd like to see an adjustment of the amount that would not pull the entire plug on this program.
So to reflect the reality of the revenue that's being generated, but to keep the resources in place for implementing the regulation.
So so I understand correctly, just adjust the revenue part of it and maintain the resource request.
Yes.
Which finance will then reject because our ratio's gone. Which may be a best way out of this, since we can't all agree, is just put it on finance. That would be the consequence of it. We justified the BCB based on the revenue, not the social policy. And as we acknowledge the revenue's not there, the BCP becomes less justifiable. And I assume finance still has the power to not put it in their budget.
They do.
Well, as I recall, though, the revenue was far exceeded the resources that were requested. So if there's simply some adjustment in the ratio, there might be some adjustment in terms of the resources that we're requesting, too. I don't know. Phase.
Okay. So Dr. Chu's request for not only the proposal to do testing on a sample, but also to look at scaling the resources for administering the program appropriately based on the revenue that we have currently recognized.
Yes.
Okay.
Understood.
And that will come back in the March meeting.
We will have it back for the March meeting.
Very well. Please call the roll.
Ms. G.
Aye.
Mr. Leonard?
No?
Ms. Steele? Dr. Chu?
Aye.
Ms. Mendel?
Aye.
Motion carries.